You step outside tonight and glance up without thinking. Maybe you see 3 stars. Maybe none. The sky is just background noise now, something your phone drowns out before you even notice it's there. But 40,000 years ago, that same sky was the most important screen your ancestors had. It was their calendar, their compass, their God, and they stared at it every single night of their lives. You don't do that anymore. Almost nobody does. So what do they actually see up there? And why did it matter so much? Picture a woman crouched outside a cave in what is now southern France. It's cold. The fire behind her is dying down. She looks up, and unlike you, she isn't scrolling past the moment. She's counting. She's been counting for weeks, tracking a bright point of light as it drifts against the fixed stars night after night, because that drift tells her something. It tells her when the herds will move, when the rains will come, when it's safe to travel and when it isn't. This woman is not unique. She is every ancient human, and the sky she watched wasn't decoration. It was survival. Here's the strange part. Your brain still has the architecture for this. You just never use it. Researchers have long debated how early this sky watching began, but one of the clearest physical clues comes from a cave in Lascaux. In the early 2000s, a German researcher named Michael Rappengluck proposed something that split the archaeology world in two. He argued that a cluster of dots painted near a bull figure wasn't random decoration at all. He argued it was a star map. Specifically, a rendering of the Pleiades, positioned exactly where you'd expect them relative to the bull's shoulder, which many now connect to the constellation we call Taurus. Think about that for a second. Someone tens of thousands of years before writing existed, before agriculture existed, before the wheel existed, climbed into a dark cave with a torch and tried to paint the sky from memory. Why would anyone do that? Because the sky was the first thing humans ever learned to read. Long before there were books, there was this. A pattern that repeated. A pattern you could trust. And your ancestors built an entire relationship with it, one night at a time. Now here's where it gets more personal than you'd think. The stars weren't just useful. They were emotional. They were where the dead went. Across nearly every ancient culture we have records of, from the Egyptians to the sand peoples of southern Africa to Aboriginal Australians, the night sky was treated as inhabited. Not empty, not cold. Inhabited by ancestors, by spirits, by stories that explained why the world worked the way it did. Anthropologist Dwayne Hamaker has spent years documenting Aboriginal Australian astronomy, some of the oldest continuous astronomical traditions on Earth. His research shows something remarkable. Certain Aboriginal groups didn't just name individual stars. They mapped entire narratives onto the dark spaces between them, using the shape of the Milky Way itself, its dust lanes and shadows, to tell stories about creation, about law, about how to live. This is called dark constellation astronomy, and it flips something you probably assumed. You likely think of constellations as the bright dots connected by lines. For some of the oldest sky traditions on Earth, the story wasn't in the light at all. It was in the darkness between the stars. Sit with that for a second. They found meaning in the gaps. You don't do that. You fill gaps. With notifications. With noise. With anything except silence. So why did your ancestors need the sky so badly, and why don't you? Here's the why ladder, one rung at a time. They needed it to survive, because tracking the moon told them when to plant and when to hunt. They needed it to navigate, because a fixed point in the sky was the only GPS available for roughly 300,000 years of human existence. They needed it to explain the unexplainable, because death, birth, and disaster all needed a story, and the sky was steady enough to hold one. And eventually, they needed it because it had become part of who they were. Not a tool anymore, an identity. Somewhere in that chain, the sky stopped being useful information and became meaning itself. That's the twist most people miss. You'd assume ancient stargazing was primarily practical, farmers and hunters just checking a natural clock. But the deeper researchers dig, the more it looks like the opposite ordering. The meaning came first, and the practical use rode along on top of it. The Lascaux painters weren't just marking a hunting season. They were making the sky permanent, dragging it down out of the dark and fixing it to stone so it could never fully disappear, even after the torch went out. They weren't managing their environment. They were trying to belong to something larger than a single short, uncertain life. And this is where the woman outside her cave comes back into the picture. She isn't just tracking a hunting season. She's doing the same thing you do at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep and your mind starts reaching for something bigger than your own problems. She's looking for a pattern that means the world isn't chaos, that there's a shape to things, even when her own life feels shapeless. You still have that instinct. It's just aimed somewhere else now. There's a study worth knowing here. Sleep researcher Jerome Siegel studied several of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies on Earth. Groups like the Hadza in Tanzania and the San in Namibia, communities whose nightly rhythms still resemble something closer to our ancestral pattern. What he found was striking. These groups had no clocks, no artificial deadlines, and yet their sleep was remarkably consistent, closely tied to the actual temperature drop of the night and, notably, the light of the moon. Sleep came later and lasted less on brighter moonlit nights. Their bodies were still listening to the sky, even without knowing they were listening. Your body still does this too, quietly, underneath all the light pollution and blue screens you've buried it in. You just can't hear it as clearly anymore because the sky doesn't get a vote in your schedule. So here's the counterintuitive part, the piece that reframes everything you just heard. You assumed the ancient obsession with stars was about superstition. Primitive people, scared of the dark, inventing gods to explain what they didn't understand yet. That's the story you were probably taught. But it wasn't fear driving most of this. It was attention. Sustained, patient, nightly attention to something outside themselves. And that attention is the actual ancestor of what you now call science, art, religion, and timekeeping, all four from the same root behavior. One woman, one bull painting, one pattern in the dark, branching into everything that came after. You didn't lose the stars because you stopped needing them. You lost them because you stopped looking up long enough to need them. The archaeoastronomer Alexander Marshack spent years examining small bone and antler fragments carved with what looked like meaningless scratches until he proposed they were something else entirely. Lunar tally marks, a running record of the moon's phases, kept by hand, kept for months at a time, tens of thousands of years ago. Whether or not every mark holds up under modern scrutiny, the underlying instinct is undeniable. Someone, in the deep cold dark of the last ice age, decided the moon was worth counting, worth remembering, worth carrying home on a piece of bone. That's not primitive. That's the beginning of memory itself, stretched out across the sky instead of a page. So tonight, step outside again. Not for a task, not for a photo. Just look up for longer than you normally would. You won't see a bull. You probably won't even see the Pleiades. The light around you has likely erased most of what your ancestors lived by. But somewhere behind your eyes, in a part of your brain that's barely changed in tens of thousands of years, something still recognizes what it's looking at. A pattern, a pull, a quiet, ancient invitation to stop scrolling and start counting again. The sky hasn't gone anywhere.